Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China in the World program here at Columbia University. We have a special guest speaker this week. He is one of our own. He is a China in the World Fellow for academic year 2022 to 2023. He's the third of the three fellows to present as a fellow here. Eyck Freymann comes to us from Oxford University, where he got his PhD. He also has master's degrees from Harvard and from Cambridge University. He already has a published book at Harvard Asia Center Press called One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World. And he's published in various venues like the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, The Economist, Foreign Policy, and The Atlantic. He's worked as a reporter for The Wire China. And he's also an author of a series of reports on breakdown in climate diplomacy in the international realm, and especially in the U.S.-China relationship. And Eyck is going to talk today about climate. And the title of his talk, as you see, is The Geopolitics of Anticipatory Adaptation to Climate Change, Evidence from China. And we're really thrilled that Eyck is here because even though he's one of our fellows, he's not always in residence. But for him, it's a homecoming because he's from the neighborhood, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and we're thrilled to have him back. So Eyck, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Daniel, for helping to set this up, and all of you who are here in person and those who might be zooming in. We can't see you, but we know you're there, and we appreciate you. I'm going to stand and hold the mic because it's more dynamic and fun in a stuffy room at 4 p.m. I'm here to speak today about the geopolitics of anticipatory adaptation to climate change. That is a mouthful, so you'll forgive me if I just call it climate geopolitics. The geopolitics of climate change, as we will see in a moment, is complex and consists of many different intersecting issues. But please know that when I say climate geopolitics, I don't mean the geopolitics of what we think of as climate diplomacy, the distributional question of how we divide up carbon emissions cuts over time. I'm speaking specifically about adaptation, how we live with the effects of climate change that reverberate through our lives, through our institutions and systems, and how we do what we can to prepare for those effects that we can foresee before they arrive. At the risk of biting off too much, I'm going to address three interrelated research questions today. One is theoretical in nature, one is discursive, and one is historical. But I think, or I hope you'll see how they come together over the course of the next 30 minutes. The theoretical question is, how does climate change adaptation connect to geopolitics in an abstract and conceptual way? The discursive question is, how does China specifically think about this question? And then the historical question is, how did China operationalize this understanding in the Arctic over the course of the last 10 to 15 years? And what can we learn about this from China's behaviors or likely future behaviors in other regions of the world as well? So I'm going to make three arguments in response. Again, they're interrelated. The first is, in a conceptual level, states adapt dynamically to anticipated climate change as they begin to foresee it. But they don't just adapt to geophysical climate change. They also adapt to the way that they think other states will respond to those changes, both the way that other states are already adapting and the ways that they assume that they are likely to adapt. I'm going to argue that China has recognized this dynamic and understands it on a conceptual level more clearly than most observers in the United States, and indeed most of the Western world. And that this explains both China's behavior in the Arctic and the sudden reemergence of geopolitical tension in a region that had been one of the most peaceful and stable on the planet throughout the 90s and the 2000s. In other words, as China, Russia, and the United States began to grasp that it wasn't just climate change that they were preparing for, it was the competition with one another that would be brought about or intensified by climate change. Competition for resources, competition for access to a region that has been inaccessible to surface navigation for most of human history, but is now in the process of opening up. The anticipation of this future competition forced them to begin preparations. And that had the effect of bringing forward that anticipated future geopolitical competition or confrontation, bringing it forward in time. First, we need to clarify some terminology because the two terms are not obvious based on their use in colloquial English. There's two basic strategies to respond to climate change. The first is mitigation. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, defines this as action to address the sources and sinks of carbon emissions. Basically, it means cutting emissions. You can't roll back the clock on climate change, but you can slow it down. And if you do enough aggressive enough mitigation, you can effectively stop the warming process later on in the century. That's at least what we understand from the best scientific models as reported by the IPCC. Mitigation is a geopolitical issue in many respects because the process of mitigating emissions is costly. And there is both a moral question of who ought to be doing the cutting, who ought to be bearing the burden, and a practical political question of who has to undertake what efforts, what cuts, if the world is to meet certain targets. For example, the Paris Agreement sets a target of collectively limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In order to do that, the world will have to figure out who will bear those costs and in time. But adaptation is an entirely different thing. It has received less scholarly attention, especially from social scientists, because it is difficult to study. Adaptation is a very general, abstract process. It just means making our institutions and our systems more resilient to the climate change that is coming, that cannot be stopped. So in a colloquial way, if mitigation is preventing the unmanageable, adaptation is managing the unpreventable. So when we think about adaptation conceptually, one of the things that makes it tricky is that we still don't know what the future of mitigation will look like. These are the 5 baseline scenarios of future emissions pathways. So each of these curves represents a certain number of billion tons of CO2 emissions per year, moving forward out into the future. You can see the green ones are optimistic. In those, we peak our emissions relatively soon and then move down to net zero. The black one is medium pessimistic, in which global emissions don't peak until the 2040s and then come down slowly. And then we can, of course, conceptualize a nightmare scenario in which emissions just keep rising. With each one, there is uncertainty, a nested uncertainty, which is expressed as a range of potential temperature outcomes and also weather effects. We don't quite know if we go in this business as usual scenario, will we get 4 degrees of warming by 2100 or 5.5? We know it's likely to be somewhere in that range, but we don't know. This is something that occupies a lot of attention from the people who work on energy policy, on the mitigation side of the story, because the question is, how much is enough? How much is enough to have confidence or some degree of confidence that we will meet our temperature target? But from the perspective of adaptation, this is a black box, because to project the future of mitigation, we have to foresee the future not only of geopolitics, but of technology, of the pace of economic growth. These are things that are intrinsically impossible to foresee. So when states are thinking about adaptation, what we're really talking about is managing uncertain risks. And this is a lot of uncertainty. It's 2 levels of uncertainty. The primary level is what emissions pathway are we on, and therefore what warming is likely to come. and how fast? And then the second is, given that, what are all of the cascading implications of that warming, and how much time do I have left to prepare for them? There is a field known as climate security, and the term climate security essentially means adaptation problems. Security problems that emerge as a result of climate change, which either have to be adapted to, or which we fail to adapt to, or that we do adapt to and our adaptive steps have negative security consequences. We can break this into categories. The first order climate effects, what I will call direct effects of climate change, are almost exclusively on human security. Yes, climate change can damage a building, it can damage infrastructure, but fundamentally, if there is an extreme weather event, what we care about is whether people are harmed, whether people die, whether people experience negative health outcomes as a result, whether people have long-term adverse impacts to their lives and livelihoods. And there's a question of how expansively we define this, but essentially it affects real people. And then there are indirect impacts, which can also affect real people, but do so via impacts on institutions and systems. Let me give you some examples. Imagine there's a flood. The flood leads to a bad harvest. Bad harvest leads to a spike in food prices and some people not having enough to eat. Leads to migration of people from the countryside to cities, strain on social services, loss of trust in or respect for the government, a breakdown of social order, conflict. Or another, sea level rise leads to people being displaced. Those people migrate into a neighboring state. That state attempts to close their border. This leads to civil war. So essentially, these are chain reactions which are triggered by a direct climate change impact, which have fundamentally a human security impact, but which ripple through institutions. The metaphor to use is dominoes falling. Climate change topples the first domino, usually with an extreme weather event, and then things fall from there. But the problem is any given impact can topple multiple sets of dominoes, right? These things are not mutually exclusive. And this is the logic for the concept of climate change as a threat multiplier. This was introduced by the Military Advisory Council. It's associated with Sherry Goodman, who's probably the preeminent spokesperson for climate security in the US today. And it's deeply embedded in the US policy discourse on climate security. But while this is a helpful framework for thinking about climate risk, and these are two very real categories of problems, I'm going to argue that it's incomplete. And the reason it's incomplete is that the climate security literature hasn't grappled with the concept of adaptation, particularly adaptation as it is done procedurally by states, thinking about their long-term strategies and thinking about anticipation. From a state's perspective, from a bureaucracy's perspective, adaptation is not something you do only after the event happens. Adaptation is also a risk management process that you undertake continuously, iteratively over time. This is something that has been theorized, but anticipatory adaptation, this has not been theorized, is a form of competitive advantage for a state. If you imagine two states, states A and B, and state A has undertaken anticipatory adaptation. So they've built seawalls along their coasts. They've built redundancy into their water system. They've got food stockpiles in case there's a bad harvest, right? They've got extra manpower in their bureaucracy to deliver basic services. And state B that has made none of these anticipatory steps. And they're engaged in a competition in the international system. And climate change is unfolding and accelerating. Well, guess what? State A is advantaged. And in fact, is likely to enjoy compounding advantages. So if I'm a state and I'm thinking about the process of adaptation, what I have to do, I have to consider multiple strains of information. The first is what I think the likely mitigation pathway is. Am I looking at 1.5 degrees of warming or 2 or 3 or 5? But I'm also interested in how my rivals are adapting. I'm interested because I want to know their best practices, but I'm also interested because adaptation is not just management of risks in response to natural disasters. It's also seizing of opportunities when they arise, including grabbing the resources in the Arctic when they emerge. So these two things are interrelated. They cannot be separated. And this has not been accounted for in the literature on climate security or on the geopolitics of climate change. Moreover, if we carry this logic through, anticipatory adaptation can become geopolitical. It can become securitized years or even decades before the physical impacts arrive, if those physical impacts can be foreseen and if other states' responses are intuitive or easy to predict. And in a zero-sum system, this means that states are going to be competing for marginal increments of resilience, which means they're going to be trying to beat the other one to take the first step in anticipatory adaptation. In other words, my rival's readiness harms my security, especially if I'm not ready. So we can distinguish between two different kinds of climate impacts here. Impacts that are mitigation dependent or contingent, ones for which the modeling is not clear. Precipitation, for example. We're very bad at modeling rain clouds, which means that for a lot of regions of the world, we have confidence that the distribution of rainfall might change, but we don't know whether on average it's going to be more or less. How do I respond to that? I mean, build preparations for droughts and preparations for floods, maybe, but it makes sense to wait until I have better information about what adaptation steps are required. Sea level rise or sea ice melt, which are effects that are essentially baked in across emission scenarios, are categorically different because I know the steps that I'm going to have to take. The only question is when. And here's a chart that actually visualizes this for you. This is from the IPCC. This is September sea ice in coverage, and you can see this trend has been going on since the 1970s. The ice cover is declining by about 13% a decade, and for the next 3 decades or so, it is baked in. So I know that in 2050, I'm going to be looking at an Arctic that is substantially ice-free for 5 months in the summer. And I know that my rivals will face that too. So the question is, what steps am I going to take and when am I going to get started? Here is a visualization of the ice cover over time. I won't play it all the way forward, but suffice it to say it's not getting any bigger. So to answer this question, looking at official sources is often insufficient, especially in the case of China. With Russia and the United States, we actually have amazingly rich resources just looking at statements that senior officials have made. But China has been extremely cautious about communicating its plans for the Arctic for a number of reasons which are obvious. The big one being that China is not an Arctic state. It doesn't have territory in the Arctic, and it has to send its ships through the Bering Strait, which is an international waterway, but is managed effectively by 2 superpowers, Russia and the United States, in order to access the region. And then once it's operating there, it doesn't have friendly ports of call where it can refuel, where it can do logistics, where if it needs search and rescue assistance, it can call for help. So China is also, for this reason, shut out of the governance systems of the Arctic. It's not a member of the Arctic Council. It's an observer, but it doesn't have a vote. And there's something called the Ilulissat Declaration, where the 5 major Arctic states got together and said, we don't need any new institutions with non-Arctic states as members, which means that China is permanently shut out of the governance of the region. China's best chance, if it is to gain a formal position in the Arctic, is to do so via a proxy, via probably an Arctic smaller polity, which wouldn't be necessarily a formal treaty ally of China, but might represent China's interests. Much of China's strategy for the region over the past decade has been to court all of the small polities, hoping that one will bite and go in for a longer-term partnership. But for obvious reasons, this is politically sensitive, and so we shouldn't expect the Chinese state to comment on it. The Arctic White Paper, which is China's formal strategy document for the Arctic, was released by the State Council in 2018, begins with the terms climate change, and it says that climate change has fundamentally changed the character of the region and has created new rights and interests for China as a result. And it describes all of these spillover impacts from the region that are affecting China to legitimize China's claim to have some kind of right to speak in the region and some right to access the global commons that are opening up. But to understand really what the strategy is, suffice it to say, we have to look at the open source. These are some of the institutions that I draw from. Obviously, because this is qualitative data, I can show you only a small cross-section of it. But for the remainder of my time, that is what I would like to dig into. So the strategy emerges around 2012, and it's first developed in the open source by analysts at the Ministry of Land and Resources. The Ministry of Land and Resources has since been reorganized, but it's linked to the State Oceanic Administration. It has kind of a longstanding interest in the Arctic, and among other things, it's responsible for making sure that China has reliable supplies of raw materials that it might need for its development. All three of these authors are analysts at the Ministry of Land and Resources, and it starts with one author who notes that climate change is improving conditions for mining. Greenland has an enormous resource of rare earths. They also have gold, they have iron, they have many other minerals, but it's not economically practical to extract them at current prices, both because of the difficulty of accessing them on land. There's no infrastructure to do that, and the expense and the risk of shipping them out once they've been extracted. Right? Most of the waters around Greenland are like this. They're full of ice. You need a special kind of ship with a double hull, and you need icebreaker escorts to make sure that you have the ability to get your ore out. It's not the cheapest place in the world to cart out ore, even though many of these resources are scattered on the surface and in theory very easy to collect. So it's noted that the Greenlandic government is politically interested in a partnership with China. It's ideal as a strategic long-term partner. There's a strategic complementarity with China's needs. Greenland, by the way, is a territory of Denmark. It's an autonomous area within the Danish realm, which is supposed to be co-equal with Denmark within the Kingdom of Denmark, but practically speaking, it's dependent fiscally and politically on Denmark. And to even contemplate independence, which the Greenlanders have long wanted, they need a ton of investment in their critical infrastructure. They essentially need to build an economy that's not built on subsidies. And they could do that through shipping, if there is future shipping in the Arctic. They can do that through mining, if foreign investors want to come in. They can do it through fishing, if they can have help, again, building their ports. But all of this is a sort of chicken and egg problem because they need so much capital investment to get started. So Songwon notes, this analyst at the Ministry of Natural Resources, that the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the world. It's actually warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world. And this has the most solar activity. So Greenland is the front line of climate change, and it's this vast virgin land, and it's a breadbasket of resources. So the strategy is you come in with familiar geoeconomic tactics, the same tactics that China was using everywhere else in the world in Belt and Road projects, but you do it with the goal of selling Greenland on a vision of long-term political alignment under climate change. So some of these tactics are as follows. You use the contradictions between the Arctic countries to pursue China's geostrategic interests. In other words, you exploit Greenland's resentment about centuries of colonization by Denmark and its resentment of the United States for using it as a military base without investing in its economy. You intervene in Greenlandic affairs, not through direct government ties, but through enterprises or civil society or scientific research. You use engineering projects to show China's might and its sophistication and its commitment, and also to bind the political interests of the partner country to China because perhaps it becomes indebted. This activity has to acknowledge that the Arctic is a geopolitically complex place, that the more China does this, the more Russia and the US might get wise to this and try to control its access, so China faces a closing window. And finally, that if China can succeed, the stakes are high because it gains future development opportunities in the region and greater ability to forestall potential military threats that could arise from the region as the US and Russia in particular start to do more there. So this is a very similar playbook to the one that we are familiar with from Sri Lanka, from Greece, from all over the world. But it's being given a very particular climate geopolitics spin. And above all, the optimism that Greenland will see things in the same way is entirely based on the assumption that Greenland's interests will shift as climate geopolitics runs its course, because Greenland can see what side of the bread is buttered as the ice warms, as the ice melts, the region warms, things open up. And suddenly Greenland has options and leverage over Denmark and the United States that it didn't have so long ago. Here's a photograph of an illicit Chinese enterprise in Greenland. They had an event. Some members of the PLA were present. They were working entirely with Greenlandic civil society groups. The Greenlandic government had no idea this had happened at all until months afterwards when a foreign researcher broke the story. So what's interesting here, and this is to me one of the funniest things he's ever tweeted, is that China's approach to anticipatory adaptation worked almost too well because it made the Americans wise to what it was trying to do, and it alerted not just the American national security establishment, but actually the American public and just interested observers all over the world that Greenland was an appreciating asset of a kind. As Trump said, it would be one of history's great real estate deals. This is a place which has not been of much economic use. It's not really even been of much geostrategic use, which is why the US has gotten away with not paying Greenland anything for access to the Thule Air Base. And yet Greenland, it's now recognized, has more leverage. And while Trump will rib it slightly on Twitter, the Greenlanders are confident enough to respond, Mr. President, we're open for business, but we're not for sale. In other words, what have you got? And the Trump administration's response is to open a consulate in Nuuk for the first time in 70 years, staff it with a consul who speaks Chinese, and begin a policy which has been continued under the Biden administration of sending Greenland unconditional cash transfers, essentially a bribe for not continuing its relationship with the Chinese. So the Trump administration also works with the Danes to block the various ventures that China has approached Greenland with, including famously its plan to renovate Greenland's airports. The Danes, after a meeting with Defense Secretary James Mattis, offered Greenland a sweetheart deal of essentially a zero-interest loan to build an airport project that Denmark had just weeks before said was completely commercially unviable. And yet the Chinese analysts are not at all dissuaded by this. They remain completely convinced that in the sweep of history, the logic that they have laid out over the previous 6 years continues to hold, because Greenland will become the first sovereign state created by climate change. When it does, it will be in large part thanks to Chinese investment and Chinese purchases of Greenlandic exports. And that in the long term, Greenland is going to become what they call a strategic strongpoint, which is a loaded term in the Chinese parlance because it has military aspects, Zhangwei. And that in the process, simply continuing to promote the Polar Silk Road will give Greenland more bargaining capital over the Danes and the Americans to accelerate its process of independence. In other words, the view is it doesn't matter that the Americans also understand the geopolitics of anticipatory adaptation. This process is inexorable And it leads to a multipolar regional order in which a small polity such as Greenland has more options. And the best strategy for Greenland in such a context is not to stick loyally by its old patron. It's either to bandwagon with the rising power that has the clearest and most effective strategy for long-term adaptation, or it's at the very least to bargain and play the superpowers against each other to see what it can get. Chinese analysts have also begun, and this leads into the very last part of the talk, to extrapolate these ideas to other regions. This first point was made by Kang Wenjung. He was a professor at the Central Party School back in 2012, where he noted that many small island states aren't so lucky as Greenland. They're not going to get rich from climate change. In fact, they face existential risk. And China has an opportunity to add pivot points to the Belt and Road for the other reason that these countries need assistance building seawalls, building other kinds of infrastructure to protect themselves from climate impacts, and that they have very few options for these sorts of aid projects because they're generally not commercially viable. They're not bankable. And so a group, this is the Lee study at the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, which has taken over China's climate aid portfolio, makes the argument for shifting China's climate aid from mitigation-focused projects to adaptation-focused projects. They point out that from the perspective of a small polity that accounts for less than 1% of emissions, it's purely symbolic to decarbonize their electricity grid. They simply have to adapt to as much climate change as the great powers create. And for that reason, China might as well present itself as the best provider, the one-stop shop of all of the adaptation assistance that they might need. Among the things that China can offer are infrastructure investments, climate observation and high-tech early warning systems, financial backstop, support for developing natural resources that may or may not be emerging through climate change, and then help with food security. China obviously has the ability to move resources around to provide consistent support for a state that might need it in a way that a democratic polity like the United States would struggle to do. So this, in a sense, is an extrapolation of the logic of climate geopolitics as developed in Greenland to other parts of the world. We see this in the Solomon Islands. We've seen it in Kiribati, where China has preferred adaptation assistance, including seawall construction, help with water treatment, other kinds of basic services that are needed as climate change and sea level rise run their course, as a way to persuade some vulnerable Pacific Island nations to switch their diplomatic recognition from Taiwan. And indeed, when Kiribati did this in 2019, Xi Jinping invited its president to the Great Hall of the People and spent the day with him. Kiribati is a country of 155,000 people. So it's no small thing for Xi Jinping to roll out the red carpet. But this has been very much part of the strategy. And as we see in communiques that emerged from the Solomon Islands just last year, China seems to be systematically trying to replicate this strategy across the Pacific. The Biden administration, by the way, has continued almost exactly the policies and almost exactly the discursive approach as the Trump administration on this issue. They've, in fact, toughened the language in U.S. strategy documents, in the Defense Department publications about China and Russia trying to exploit the consequences of climate change for geopolitical gain. They've restaffed the consulate in Nuuk with even more Mandarin language speakers. This is Secretary Blinken in Greenland, where he flew around and saw the ice sheet with the Greenlandic prime minister. And the Biden administration also started a program for small island states to help them deal with the twin threats of climate change and predatory investment. I wonder who that could be referring to. So if we step back, I want to leave you with two key points, contributions to the literature. Aside from this, what I think fascinating empirical question is about why Greenland might have considered partnership with China and whether it's actually a smarter choice to go with China as climate geopolitics accelerates if you are a small climate exposed state. There's two really significant takeaways for theory. The first is that anticipatory adaptation seems to be a plausible geopolitical strategy, especially if your rivals are not doing it. Adapting, demonstrating to the world that you can create incremental preparedness and resilience for yourself, and demonstrating that you can provide that to your partners does confer an edge. It's not necessarily decisive in the case of Greenland, but it does create options and certainly at minimum a set of very persuasive diplomatic talking points that were not available otherwise. The second is that anticipatory adaptation is a kind of climate security issue. Indeed, I think we need to add it as a third category of climate security issue. There's the direct effects on human lives and livelihoods. There's the indirect effects on states and institutions that follow in time from the first domino that falls when a climate impact hits. But if my theory is correct, anticipatory adaptation to climate change can start creating geopolitical issues, crises, points of conflict or tension, large and small, years or even decades before the climate impacts that they are about arrive. And even if those impacts never happen at all, because the motivations and the procedural analytic process that states have to go through and reconcile when they're thinking about adaptation to climate change are intrinsically connected to every other aspect of what they do, including geopolitical competition. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
So I have a comment and a couple of questions. So if China's encouraging Greenland to declare independence from Denmark, it kind of runs against other aspects of China's foreign relations, it seems to me. It's just a comment. But even if that were the goal that you've uncovered to get Greenland to declare independence from Denmark, why would an independent Greenland not just sell its resources on the international marketplace, regardless of any Chinese investments or any special relationship with China, just basically accept the benefits of the infrastructure built by China and then sell to the highest bidder? How would China have a special hold over any of these resources released by the melting ice cap?
Well, there's a couple of theories.
You gotta suck here.
There's a couple of theories. The first would be that in the process of building the infrastructure required to achieve independence, to develop the economy that can be substantially independent from Danish subsidies that Greenland could even contemplate independence, the Greenland would have to go deeply into debt to China. And indeed, the cost of the airports project alone is estimated at around 20% of Greenland's GDP. Greenland is completely fiscal.
How many people?
56,000 people. So completely incapable of repaying that debt, except in the most implausibly optimistic possible scenarios of Greenlandic economic boom. And Greenland's actually losing population as all of the talent migrates away. So there is a debt trap argument. And when I interviewed Aleqa Hammond, who's the former prime minister of Greenland, who pursued the deal, she said her Chinese financial interlocutors told her, don't worry, whatever the price tag is, you figure out what you need to build, we'll fund it with debt finance. Well, from a debt trap argument, that's one perspective that would provide China with leverage. A second possibility is that these mines which would be developed are not selling their product on the open market. They're a build, operate, transfer agreement of some kind. So it wouldn't necessarily be a Chinese firm. In fact, the rare earths mining case, a Chinese state-owned enterprise took a minority stake in an Australian firm. which they substantially controlled because those resources had to go to China to be processed. And the idea is the company, Greenland, it's called Greenland Minerals, would build the mine, build the port attached to the mine, operate the mine, and then take the ore that they extracted from the mine to facilities in China, where China would then become an essential node in the supply chain. China was also going to provide essential technical support because China happens to have the best practices on rare earths extraction and processing. So the company's business model didn't work without continued buy-in from its Chinese partners, even though they happen to be a minority shareholder. And then the third argument would be that China would be interested for the same reasons that China wants civilian port access anywhere in the world, which is they want not necessarily the dual use aspect that they would turn it into a base and suddenly be filling it to the gills with ammo and weapons platforms, but that they would be using it as a friendly port of call to sustain operations on a higher tempo basis in the region and simply create a level of presence that they didn't have otherwise. And that alone has been perceived by Washington as threatening and problematic, correctly or not, which is why the United States has pressured many countries, especially in the Americas and the Western Hemisphere, to reject Chinese investments into ports, even if there are minority stakes.
Thanks. Other questions? Yeah, maybe use that mic for the Q&A.
Thanks, Eyck, for the talk. I really enjoy it. So I have two questions. So the first one is, forgive my ignorance. So is there any other option like state in that region that are available for China to exert influence in addition to Greenland? And the second question is, I think the empirical study is is fascinating, but I'm just wondering what kind of evidence do you expect to verify or falsify your theory?
Yeah. Two very helpful questions. So the Arctic Council consists of the 8 circumpolar states. They are Russia, which is friendly to China, but is structurally hostile to China achieving an independent base of operations in the region, because Russia's whole concept of the Northern Sea Route is they will be China's gatekeeper. They will collect a toll from China's operations. If China has an independent position, then China is just sailing around near Russia's northern frontier, and that they become a threat. The United States, presumably not. Canada, presumably not. So there's 5 smaller states. There's Denmark via Greenland and the Faroe Islands, and China tried in both cases. There's Iceland, which is the next most plausible option, and China tried, but they badly misplayed their hand. A Chinese businessman tried to buy an enormous amount of land, about 100 square miles, for an ecological golf course in a place that's frozen over for 10 and a half months out of the year, and successfully wooed all of the local officials. But when the media got wind of it and realized that this clearly had some kind of open-ended, nefarious, possibly military angle, and that he wasn't actually the businessman entirely independent that he was pretending to be, but that he had deep links to the state, he was a party member and so forth, the political winds shifted, and Iceland has since uniformly rejected any Chinese attempts to open up Iceland for meaningful foreign direct investment, especially land purchases. So Iceland off the table. Finland doesn't have the coastline. So the other option would be Norway, and China tried really hard. Well, they actually tried in Finland too, but didn't work out as well. That was sort of scotched immediately. The one that they tried was in the north of Norway, a port called Kirkenes. And again, they got all the local officials behind it. And then Oslo, likely at the behest of the United States, squash it on national security grounds at the last minute,
They
tying
used
it
it
up.
as a tourist hub, didn't they?
Yeah.
They sent a bunch of Chinese tourists there on package tours.
That was a strategy in the early 2010s, luxury tourism. The idea is this is one of these intervene through enterprises approaches. But what I think, if you want to sort of step back and ask, why did the strategy fail? Might it have succeeded? And I think it totally might have succeeded. But what happened was failure to massage the domestic politics in the partner countries, and failure to recognize that China would lose its head start and advantage in anticipatory adaptation once the United States and Russia and other countries realized what it was doing and started to take their own anticipatory steps. And indeed, now the United States is sending more aircraft to Alaska. They're deploying more troops in longer term rotations to Alaska. They're building a new deepwater port astride the Bering Strait. They're building a new set of icebreakers. The U.S. is, as Mike Pompeo put it, late to the party in the Arctic, but they're trying to catch up because they now recognize the importance of anticipatory adaptation. And as that happens, China has lost its head start. In terms of the question of how would you falsify the theory, I go into that in my book in a lot more detail, but essentially I need to find evidence from either public documents produced by the state itself or from scholars affiliated with sufficiently prominent institutions that they're credible, that express the following views. A, the geography has to be changing. B, interests have to be changing meaningfully as a result of that geographic change. C, states are already or are going to respond in anticipation of those changes happening, right? And then that has to be mapped to a set of state behaviors that would not otherwise be explicable. So the hope is to make it falsifiable, but I wasn't gonna tire you with that in my 30 minutes.
Is Russia doing anything to maintain their gatekeeper status? I know you've gone into a little bit what the US is doing, but what is Russia entering the conversation as far as Greenland? I know they have a less sway there. And then what is Denmark doing more specifically with Greenland? Are they changing how they interact with the Greenland government, and then also the smaller, where China's targeting more, the smaller villages?
Russia has never been a major player in Greenland because the United States has made sure of it. The history is interesting. Denmark controlled Greenland as a colony for over 200 years through the 1940s, and kept them under a trade monopoly, completely isolated from the outside world. And then when the Nazis rolled into Copenhagen in 1940, the supply ships stopped coming to Greenland. And the two Danish administrators who had drawn the short stick and had to be sent to the other side of the planet to freeze, right? The most junior people in the foreign ministry, essentially, found themselves as the de facto leaders of this territory, which the Nazis did not control, but which needed an external source of food and fuel. And they essentially defected to the United States and, in violation of Danish law, handed over Greenland to the United States, which then proceeded to use it as a military base for 16 military bases to convoy material and men to Europe. It was very significant geostrategically in World War II. A lot of great history. The Nazis at one point built some field stations there. They were discovered. There was a battle on dog sled. But since then, the U.S. has maintained a military position in Greenland and has made it very, very difficult for any Russian nationals to enter the territory. And the Danes obviously have had no interest in allowing that to happen. So Russia has not really been a player in Greenland itself. They have been a significant player in the Arctic as a whole, and they have militarized much of their northern frontier. There's a debate about how much of that is offensive versus defensive. Clearly, the geography is changing in some ways not in their favor, in that they've had a frozen wall protecting their northern flank forever, which is in the process of melting. But they have a vision of developing the northern sea route, which essentially connects Asia to Europe along the northern coast of Russia, in a way that requires Chinese participation at a minimum. Because it's not going to be viable as a transshipping route for a long time, but they've got energy there that they could sell. And under sanctions, since Ukraine, the West isn't buying. So that goes to Russia. That goes to China. And the Russians and the Chinese are partnering more, though the balance of influence is shifting in the Chinese direction. For the obvious reasons that the Russians no longer have an alternative buyer for their energy, and they need that as a source of foreign currency. In terms of Greenland's place in the Danish realm, right now Greenland has a center-left government, which has been historically more friendly to Greenland. The symbolism of having an equal role alongside Denmark matters a lot. Greenland is a very small place. It's an indigenous society. It's 90% indigenous. And so Greenland being treated as an equal, being allowed to fly the flag, to use the language, to sit next to Denmark as an equal member at the table when Arctic issues are discussed.
Is there anyone in the legislature?
They've got 2 members of the 180 members of the Danish legislature. Full voting members.
Oh, so they're part of the country.
They are part of the country. Yeah. But
That's not a colony. You always call them a colony.
well, they were a colony.
Yeah.
They were a colony until World War II. After World War II,
Yeah.
there was a history that is complex that I won't go into. They end up getting home rule in 1979, and then they vote in 2008 to move towards independence. It's like a non-binding referendum of intent to move towards independence. So the Danes have said that if the Greenlanders can figure out how to make independence work, they can get independence on day one. But they should also expect the subsidies to stop on that day. So the Greenlanders need to think about what comes next. And that's the argument for partnership with China, that if they can make the economics work, they could snap their fingers and make independence happen tomorrow. And the Danes have already committed to saying yes, which is why the Danes have to use national security as an excuse to stop or use various other techniques to block Chinese investment into Greenland, because the Danes don't actually want the Greenlanders to leave. As one Danish member of parliament told me, with Greenland, we're a great power. Without Greenland, we're just a fourth-tier former European empire.
Please, you have the mic there.
Sure. Thanks very much for the talk. I just have a question about the kind of window of opportunity, if it still exists for China, given the sort of worsening external environment for them in international discourse over the last few years. Is there still a window of opportunity? And if so, how long, how wide open do you think that window is? And a second follow-up question is, how do you think this idea of anticipatory adaptation kind of relates to, say, literature on hedging in other contexts of other states, in terms of playing off, say, the US and China in other kind of ways?
I think China's window for gaining what they call a strategic strong point in the Arctic has almost entirely closed. But I would not rule out the possibility of another political shift to the left in Greenland that brings this back onto the agenda. Greenland is, because it is an indigenous society that is trying to be an example to the indigenous peoples of the world, has a very particular understanding of its place and the nature of its society. And because it's been sheltered from international affairs by virtue of its geography and its history, it thinks about its relations with other states differently. It's not in a rush. Some members of the Greenlandic parliament are in a rush, but the society as a whole tends to believe the situation is broadly improving. Climate change is broadly bringing more opportunities than risks and costs. As the former prime minister told me, thank God for climate change.
Yeah, someone has to like it, right?
Yeah. They might be. This is controversial in Greenland, and she's not necessarily a representative, but there is a sense that Greenland is committed to getting independence. There's a debate about whether we should do it soon, and maybe the U.S. could facilitate that sooner because it's easier. They already have a presence. Maybe the Chinese can help to do it in a different context. But there's an open-mindedness to what may come. And I sensed when I was there a willingness to play hardball when the time is right. In terms of your question about hedging versus balancing bandwagoning, I think the theme that emerges from my comparative research is that the ability to hedge is a luxury that broadly comes from perceiving that you are an appreciating asset under climate change, that climate change presents substantial opportunities which afford the luxury of not having to choose. And for a small state, there's always a trade-off between your autonomy and your security. Small states are always navigating this, and security threats come from many angles. They can come from the climate itself. They can come from other states. They can come from dynamics that could emerge from climate change interacting with other states. And different actors, intelligent, rational actors within a small state may disagree about what the nature of those risks are. And I think you can interpret the debate in Greenland in that context. Those who say we should partner with the United States are generally of the view geopolitics is running its course, and it's going to make our neighborhood a very iffy, unstable neighborhood. And therefore, we don't have an option. We need to stay with our traditional backers and try to get as much support and attention from them as we can.
Who are they?
Who are they?
The traditional backers.
The United States and Denmark.
Okay, so could they be using these Chinese flags and these Chinese emplacements in Greenland to make the U.S. and Danes jealous?
Some of them are, but some of them also believe that China offers a superior option because China is rising economically and geopolitically, because China understands climate adaptation better, and because China is friendlier to small developing polities like Greenland, and because China cares about having access to Greenland more than the U.S. cares about China not having access to Greenland, and therefore China is willing to offer more. But if you are a small state that is substantially vulnerable to climate change, if you are a sinking Pacific island that could be underwater by the end of the century, unless you get adaptation help or some miracle happens on the mitigation side, you have fewer options because the time is not on your side. And this may mean that you create a ruckus and some bargaining procedure in the short term to try to call attention to yourself and see what goods you can extract from the superpowers. But ultimately, you cannot afford the insecurity of possibly not having any backer at all. And therefore, you need to bandwagon with the side that's most powerful, most capable of helping you adapt. And it seems that Kiribati and the Solomon Islands have made the decision that that is China. And so they have bandwagoned with China. That would be my perception. So it has mostly to do with the perception of risk at the small state level.
Stephanie, go ahead. Yeah, use the mic. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much. Learned a lot from this presentation. I was wondering, you talked a little bit about how China is not as explicit in its Arctic ambitions and government statements, and that China is looking for small proxies that are Arctic states and sort of, obviously within the Arctic Council to pursue its goals. How different is that from other non-Arctic states that have been pursuing things such as observer status in the Arctic Council? So South Korea, Japan, India. I know the EU has been interested, but, got deferred for a bit. So I'm curious, to how different is China in both of these approaches? And is that attributable mostly to Chinese economic power or something else about Chinese foreign policy in general?
It's a good question. If you look back at the Chinese academic literature from, say, 2013, 2014, when the commodity supercycle was at its peak. This was at the time when it actually seemed like it might be sensible to invest in these frontier areas, because as commodity prices rise, stuff that's in the ground that is very expensive, requires a lot of upfront investment to get out, starts looking attractive. And then as commodity prices fall, the logic shifts and investors who have a profit motive broadly lose their interest in places like this. So back at the time when Greenlandic minerals were looking like a very, very interesting investment indeed, the Japanese and the South Koreans were also looking at them. And one of the considerations, and I didn't go into this, but there's some amazing sources on this, behind China's approach to Greenland is we need to build all this infrastructure now to show Arctic small states that we are a better provider of this infrastructure than the Japanese and the South Koreans can be. But since 2014, Greenland has fallen off of the radar of any development bank that cares about getting paid back, let alone any private investor. And so Japan and Korea have broadly lost interest in Greenland. What was interesting is that Chinese sources, and some of these were published in the People's Daily. This is not, some, professor at a lowly university writing a cockamamie theory. This was serious business. The Greenlandic Minister of Natural Resources visited China and met with Li Keqiang. Usually, that's a protocol thing. You don't have that happen. The Chinese logic was, it is precisely because we are willing to invest in projects that everyone knows are destined to lose money, that we are going to prove our political commitment to Greenland. And that is why they will choose us. So I think because no one else is willing to do that, China differentiated itself very early from other non-Arctic states.
Someone else? Someone online, only Jack Daniel can do that. Yeah, go ahead.
I may just one more. Yeah, I think you kind of related to it just there in your response to that last question. But what do you think the biggest obstacles for success for both China and the US in terms of anticipatory adaptation, and why do they differ for each state?
The Arctic is only one very small component of anticipatory adaptation. Anticipatory adaptation starts at home because even though in theory climate change adaptation presents risks and opportunities, and an opportunity that is worth exactly the same on the positive side as a risk on the negative side is equally worth thinking about and working on. Most states and people are risk and loss averse, so we're going to focus on the risk and the loss. Most of adaptation has to do with protecting your domestic front against climate risk. And part of that has to do with building resilience to direct impacts. We're looking at seawalls in Miami Beach, for example. And then it also has to do with this much more abstract question of how you de-risk your financial system from climate change. There's stuff you can do on the regulatory side. You can force disclosure on climate risks. You can do it on the insurance side by restricting whether public funds will be used to insure things that shouldn't be insured because they're doomed. There's industrial policy that you can pursue. In a sense, developing a renewable energy industry ecosystem. It's mitigating climate change, but it's also an adaptation to a new reality in which the world is headed towards getting more energy from new sources. And so maybe you're building the industrial base to create products that people will buy. I think this is primarily the focus for the US and China. In the United States, because of how Congress works and because of our federal system, most of this ends up happening at the state and local level, or it's driven just organically by the market. For example, if you look at property prices in Miami Beach, you can get a discount if you want to buy in a flood zone, but that's because the market understands that at some point in the future, that won't be insurable anymore. People are already reacting. And in a society where the market has that disciplining, is allowed to have that disciplining function, a certain amount of adaptation just happens in anticipation, and we don't even see it happen. So there's an argument that in that respect, China is less resilient. But China has also shown through COVID that it has extraordinarily resilient institutions. It has very, very powerful state capacity. And in its 2022 national strategy on climate change, they've set this dizzying array of targets, which include becoming a basically climate adapted society in all respects by 2035. So if you buy that, that is a plausible goal, which many climate scientists do not. But if you buy that, China's plan is to become much, much, much more resilient by 2035 than it is today. China is overcoming natural disadvantages. They've got less arable land and a lot more people. They have already problems with flooding and drought. They have many, many major cities that are super vulnerable to sea level rise. So they are starting at a disadvantage. And this is part of the reason why anticipatory adaptation has been so baked into China's thinking about climate change back to the 2000s, because you don't have to be a genius to understand that China needs state planning to address some of these threats, and that if they wait until the physical effects of climate change happen, it's going to be far too late. And this will be a big threat, not only to China's growth model, but to its social stability. I think there's a question whether the United States will get complacent because we enjoy much more of a buffer geographically, in terms of how we operationalize anticipatory adaptation in our foreign policy. So I don't think that this is 50% of China's thinking about anticipatory adaptation. I think it's 5%. But it could nevertheless be important if it becomes one of the key dimensions of China's foreign policy. And it's a very dominant part of Chinese foreign policy in parts of the world that the US doesn't think a lot about. Because there does, as one Chinese source says, and I'll end here, there does, if you think about it intuitively, there's probably a Matthew effect where the great power that presents itself as the one that's best able to adapt to climate change, best able to provide climate adaptation goods, is going to become the provider of climate adaptation assistance to all of the vulnerable states. And the more states are flocking to that one provider of support, the more that seems like the safe bet for the next one. So in terms of China's relations with the developing world, this could end up becoming very significant.
Let me ask you another question based on my first one. Sure. I'm trying to figure out what an outsider should be worried about with China and Greenland. So when you started your talk, I got this sense that Greenland was going to become a source of extremely valuable natural resources that would be freed up by the melting ice cap, and that China was getting in early to get a special relationship with a Greenland government that could declare independence, be close to China, and would be beholden to China because China was making early loans for infrastructure. The problem with that is it doesn't seem to jibe with the debt trap diplomacy argument that China's making a bunch of bad loans that no one else will make in order to get those relationships. Because if this stuff is so valuable, it's going to be unleashed, they'll be able to pay it back. So if I'm worried about this really expensive stuff, then I'm not really worried about the loans being bad loans. I'm worried about the loans being good loans, and that they're going to put this money in and they're going to get tons of stuff back, either in the form of something that's marketable, like you said, in the transnational production chain that's processed in China that everybody needs, or in terms of some strategic resource that's useful for the military that China will have a monopoly on, that will help them in some other sphere besides economics. But then there was another argument that said what they're really looking for is access to ports in this part of the world because they're kind of excluded from this part of the world. And maybe they're not going to be naval bases, but they will be refueling ports for other projects. And I'm not really sure what to worry about. Like, I'm not sure. I'm always skeptical of debt trap diplomacy because I don't think Chinese bankers think that way in general. And I think they want to get repaid. So unless I'm convinced that they know they're not going to get repaid and they're giving the loans anyway, then I'm skeptical. So, but maybe it's true here. But if it's true here, it's not because these great natural resources are going to be unleashed, because that would be plenty of, that would provide plenty of funding to pay back the loans. So it must be something else. Is it the ports? I don't know what to worry about. I want to worry, but
Okay. Let's see if Tom, let's see if I can give you something to worry about. So on the question of the debt trap, I think that's the easiest one to take, which is it a commercial rate or not? If you're willing to offer a loan at 0% interest or close to 0% interest, then and you're willing to get basically no return for a very long period of time, then you're willing to bet in something speculative because you'll get paid back at the end of the day.
But only at 0%. It's still aid then.
Yeah.
Because you could have done something else with the money and made more.
Yeah, it was like why did share prices of a bunch of tech companies that don't make any money zoom during COVID? Well, because the Federal Reserve cut interest rates to 0.
Mm-hmm.
And when you cut interest rates of 0, the cost of capital is 0. So investors don't care. They can borrow money and they can invest it in something that maybe will get big in 20 years.
Yeah.
So it's partly a function of the interest rate and whether as a lender, you are facing discipline from your shareholders to generate a reasonable return on capital in keeping with what market interest rates are, which are floating around. And as a sovereign lender or a development bank, you make decisions under certain conditions. You might be willing to make a concessionary loan. You're willing to lend for under market rate just to be nice or to get political benefits of some other kind. And Greenland was an example of a place where the Chinese were, to be clear, they never made a formal offer of financing for the airports. They told the Greenlandic prime minister at the time, whatever it is that you want to build, we'll fund it. That's not how development banks typically lend.
Right.
They want to do due diligence on the project to make sure that it can pay for itself. Yeah. So it's like if you say I have a startup idea and I say, great, Tom, I'll invest. And you say,
bad idea,
you said you haven't even heard what it's about. So I think this is an indication that in this particular case, we're not talking about a lot of money, right? We're just talking about a lot of money relative to a polity of, a polity of 56,000 people that has a GDP of a couple of billion.
Right. So, but this is a different process than debt trap diplomacy. This is something that China rarely does in the world. It is basically just aid. China does give aid to some countries. It sometimes builds sports stadiums.
Except this was a form of a loan, Tom. And that's the difference.
Okay, so it's a loan, but it's a loan at 0%. So it's still aid. But the standard.
But it wasn't at 0%.
Oh, okay.
They didn't offer terms. They didn't offer terms. I said there are contexts in which you can make those sorts of arrangements. But clearly, when you do concessional loans, you do it for political benefits, for political reasons, right?
Or because you want to be beneficent, right?
Yes, or because you want the optionality. If Greenland can't pay back any of the money at all, you want the political leverage to say, well, guess what? we want to expand our partnership, and now we want to go into telecoms.
Mhm.
And we want to do more cooperation and more critical infrastructure in Greenland
Mhm.
so that we become an essential provider of public goods for Greenland.
And the long-term purpose of all of that is to get these
Which-
natural resources that are being freed up by.
Yeah, which makes us hard to dislodge from Greenland, which means that there is a place in the Arctic where we cannot be
Just following the
dislodged,
chain. Yeah.
where we have access to resources and access
Okay,
to ports.
all right, got it. Thanks. Now I'm worried again, just for different reasons.
To be clear, it's not going to happen in Greenland, probably.
Yeah,
but
because you said they're onto them.
they're onto them. And because what the Chinese analysts were over optimistic about is, I guess, China's willingness to dump enough money into Greenland that it would become a fiscally viable place. And turns out it requires a bit more than building airports. The entire
Right.
economy is based on state aid right now. So you need to find people, ways to, you have to employ the population. It's not just a one-off investment, but I think more to the point, they didn't realize that even though legally all the pieces are there for Greenland to leave, politically, socially, if you go to Greenland and you talk to the people on the ground, it's more complicated. And what does this mean for the theory? It means that climate geopolitics is operative all the time whenever state actors are thinking about anticipatory adaptation as a contributing motive to what they do. But it's not a variable that's easy to isolate because it's intertwined with other considerations, including local ones that we don't really think about. So the character of what I call climate geopolitics is going to be very different from place to place. It's not necessarily going to be the same in Greenland as it is in the South Pacific. The same sort of frameworks of how the actors are thinking about it are likely to be at play. But the practical consequences are going to be different. And there's no guarantee that just because one side had the idea of climate geopolitics before the others, that means that they're destined to succeed.
What's the chance that it's all a scam? That
Mhm.
that you have various Chinese entities that are telling the Chinese state, give us a bunch of money to build an airport in Greenland because Greenland's melting and there's rare earths in them hills and it's all going to be freed up. And plus it will give us a geostrategic standpoint in North America, and we'll be able to send our ships there in the future. Great way to compete with the United States. In the same way that like pipelines through Burma for oil were dumb, right?
Mhm.
But they were really sold very hard to Beijing as necessary for China's security because of the Malacca dilemma.
Mhm.
You had to have pipelines through Burma, but the oil that goes through the pipes in Burma is just so much more expensive than anything else that would be shipped around. But they convinced people to invest in these pipelines. What's the chance it's that? I'm just trying to do like alternative hypotheses for the same outcome. Like this
It was
these
just
are-
bureaucratic stupidity.
No, bureaucratic brilliance. Because the bureaucracy is getting tons of money from Beijing because they sold the story that China needs a foothold in Greenland for China's national interest in a long-term competition with the United States. And they're raking in the money because they're getting the finance for this airport and they're cutting off a 10% profit off the top, just like all city projects in New York, right? Someone's getting money.
It doesn't explain this, right? It doesn't explain the overwhelming amount of diplomatic and political attention that China has been paying to small island states that are vulnerable to climate change all over the world.
Mhm.
The
Yeah,
Solomon Islands are a great example. Xi Jinping didn't actually meet the head of the Solomon Islands when the deal was signed, which is why I chose this picture instead. But when the Solomon Islands and China did this communique, it mentioned climate cooperation as well as a whole host of other things, including
Yeah.
military basing.
Yeah, military base.
And by the way,
I get the Solomons. I get the
and when the Solomons shifted recognition in the same year in 2019, the Prime Minister's chief of staff said that China's position on climate change was a key reason for why.
Yeah, I get Kiribati and I get the Solomons and I see the nature of the competition there. And I think China is sincere in saying like these countries really need infrastructure support and other help in the near term, and other countries aren't providing them very much. So they have an opportunity there. But Greenland just seems a little different than this. But I see as a global project, this is great, and I think China will be good at it. I just kind of understand why they want footholds in the South China in the South Pacific more than I understand why they want a foothold in the North Atlantic.
Well, if you just have to read the Chinese sources, and they say it's primarily about minerals and fisheries. It's making sure that
Fisheries are big, right? Yeah.
China gets a fair cut of the resources
Yeah.
that are in the global commons, which China believes that it has a right to alongside every other state, and make sure that it has a foothold in this region, so it has a voice to what happens.
Yeah.
If we're headed into a higher emissions warming scenario, the Arctic ice could be all gone. And who even knows how the geopolitics of the region will evolve?
Yeah. And
that could create spillover risks that affect Chinese interests.
Yeah.
And China wants to make sure that it has a seat at the table if and when that happens. And if they wait until 2070 to ask for that seat at the table, guess what? They're not getting it. So as far as I'm concerned, the Chinese strategy is extremely reasonable and highly strategic and rational, and actually pretty fair given China's rights and interests under international law. But it has this unintended effect, which is evoking American, Russian, Greenlandic, Norwegian, Danish understandings of climate geopolitics, which elicit climate geopolitical reactions from those states, and brings about a new state of affairs that no one necessarily foresaw and which no one necessarily benefited from, because the geopolitical tension that is projected to arise from future climate change gets brought forward as soon as it can be foreseen. And if this can happen in the Arctic of all places, the most random and remote of all places, couldn't it happen anywhere?
Do you have anybody online with a question?
There are no questions on them.
Okay. What time is it?
5:02.
All right, it's
Basically,
time.
we're basically
It's time to wrap it up.
Yeah.
We have food, right?
we have lots of fish.
Outstanding.
Let's go.
Thanks so much, Ike.
Thank you for coming.